I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. I want to tell all of you a story. This is a story that's been told millions of times by millions of people. It's a story we've spent nearly 6 years learning together, a story with heroes and villains, love and hate, saviors and murderers, devotion and betrayal, giving and taking away, peace and war, altruism and greed, achievements and slothfulness, starvation and gluttony, generosity and envy, detestation and lust, kindness and wrath, shame and pride. And at the end of it all, this is a story about life and death itself. This is a story of humanity in all of its glory and depravity. Certain figures throughout human history are worth studying. These figures are often influential, and frequently their legacy isn't realized until long after their deaths. Why, though? Why do we take note of these figures? I think it's because they teach us something about ourselves that transcends the time in which they lived. They carry with them aspects of what makes humans human. There are, however, other reasons to focus on these individuals. In our case, this man started a religion that grew and flourished in frontier America and now boasts membership of more than 16 million people. It is the most politically powerful and wealthiest religion in America. American history, broadly, would be different had this person not founded the religion of Mormonism. This forces us to take a step back and ask how things got to be the way they are, the very purpose of studying history to begin with. The existence of what we see today requires explanation. In the context of Mormonism, we have the Book of Mormon. How did it come to be? How did the other books of Mormon scripture come to be? These questions are the first place to begin an understanding of the prevailing religion in Utah today, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The founder of this religion truly defies description. He's a man who is, by all measurements, stranger than fiction. The largest descendant religion from the cult Joseph Smith created has a sales force of tens of thousands of young adults handing out his writings, teaching those who were curious about this man's life and legacy, seeking converts to the tune of hundreds of thousands of people every year. These missionaries will tell you about a young boy who at the age of 14 was disenchanted with the religions and all of the religions he saw in the world around him. This young boy ventured into the woods and he prayed to God to guide him to the correct religion. In an unexpected turn of events, Elohim and Jesus Christ appeared to young Joseph. Jesus told him all the creeds were an abomination in his sight and that those professors were all corrupt. In a few short years after this first vision, young Joseph was visited by the angel Moroni and instructed over the period of 4 years in the ways of God. After this brief probationary period, Moroni led Joseph to a place known as Hill Cumorah, where Joseph discovered ancient gold plates written by ancient Israelite Native Americans who sailed to America in 2500 BC and 600 BC and also believed in Christianity. They practiced the original religion created by God and completed by Jesus Christ, which was lost during the Great Apostasy, which led Joseph to becoming the prophet of the restoration, when he restored that religion by translating those gold plates into English by the gift and power of God. He was a great prophet who gave many revelations beyond the Book of Mormon, which were compiled together into the Doctrine and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price. These, with the Bible, comprise the standard works of the gospel. If you simply agree to take that missionary's copy of the Book of Mormon and schedule an evening visit, they'll be happy to answer any questions you might have and teach you how families were together before birth and can be together for eternity. These missionaries are clean. They're well-behaved looking young people. They'll even help you do yard work, or they'll carry in your groceries for you if you need it. They'll be happy to tell you that they came out on this mission as soon as they graduated high school of their own volition, and they even paid for the entire mission themselves by working summer jobs and saving up before they left. These missionaries look so good. They don't drink or party like nearly everybody else their age. They always smile, and their work ethic is unparalleled. This religion must be a good place to raise a family, you think. You take a few lessons. You learn more stories of how Mormon scripture came to be, the deeper doctrines, the temple ordinances, the plan of salvation, the word of wisdom. Anything you might want to know, they spoon-feed right into your hungry mind. As long as you show willingness to listen to what they say and don't give any pushback whatsoever, they'll keep showing up with big smiles. But, God forbid, if you ask them about a rock in the hat, polygamy, the Kirtland Safety Society, or anything else which doesn't fit perfectly into the scripted narrative that they're selling, those missionaries fall silent. They get shifty-eyed. They begin to reschedule visit times. They stop coming around so often. Eventually, they break all contact because you're led astray by the ever-present force that is the adversary. Around the world, in over 120 countries, in over 100 languages, this same script plays out in tens of thousands of households every single day. These young adults, who know very little of how the world works, are telling unsuspecting people about the history of Mormonism and Mormon scripture. They are the people telling the story of Joseph Smith and the early church that he formed. There's a problem, though. It's all a lie. It's a lie carefully contrived and correlated for over a century and a half to be appealing, beautiful, and faith-promoting. The lie runs so deep that these missionaries don't know they're telling you a lie. They were lied to their entire life, as were their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents and their great-great-great-great-grandparents who were converted to the church by Joseph Smith themselves. This lie has such a powerful hold on these kind and good-hearted young adults that the second a single iota of truth is introduced to them, they're so thoroughly and unflinchingly conditioned to shut down their minds so no information can penetrate those mental barriers. With only a few exceptions which prove the rule, complete and total adherence to this lie is the only way to survive in the church. Members go their entire lives with these mental survival mechanisms, acting as intellectual white blood cells to attack and eliminate any outside information which contradicts the lie. But with enough information, that mental immune system becomes overwhelmed. Cognitive dissonance causes enough discomfort that these people will begin to place forbidden questions onto the center stage of their minds. The information contagion needs only one question to take root. Was Joseph Smith really a prophet of God? And from that single cell, it can grow and expand into more questions. Given a nurturing mental environment, that question eventually becomes an afterthought as far more difficult questions push their way to the front of these people's minds. Did Joseph Smith print counterfeit money? Did Joseph Smith manufacture a set of gold plates? Did Joseph Smith assassinate people in the name of God? Did Joseph Smith create treason? Did Smith rape teenage girls? What reason do I have to believe anything this monster ever said? Once these questions are rooted deep within the synapses of a believer's mind, the monolith, which endowed an incredibly resilient system of beliefs into their minds, begins to crumble. A new set of questions present themselves. Am I the only person with these questions? Who can I share these questions with? Where can I go to find a support system of people with the same questions that I have? If the morals the church raised me with are flawed, what are my morals? Why was this information hidden from me for so long? How could I have been so stupid to believe these lies my entire life? Will my family shun me if I take off my garments? If the one true religion is false, are all religions false? If the church lied to me about its history, what else are they lying about? The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a cult. It has taught us a false narrative of its history to push its agenda. It has deliberately obfuscated, suppressed, or outright lied about how it came into existence because the truth really is stranger than fiction. The painstaking and tenuous process of revisionist Mormon history has been a fight raging among academics for over a century. In many ways, revisionism in Mormon history is nearly as old as the religion itself. From the first satirical expose written while the Book of Mormon was being published, people devoted to exposing truth have been firing shots at the absurdity of Joseph Smith's story since the beginning. When we consider the landscape of Mormon history, it's never been a fair fight. Anytime a fact fights a religious belief, that belief proves unrelenting and tenaciously resilient in spite of the facts. Doubt your faith before you doubt the facts falters in pathological immunity to doubt your doubts before you doubt your beliefs. People retreat to a comfortable lie before venturing into the uncomfortable unknown. This aspect of the human condition gives the colossus of lies an upper hand in every fight for the mind because it's already won the heart. The fight for the mind has never been fair. The church has coordinated its history, its suppressed documents, hidden uncomfortable truths behind partial lies, and constructed a fictitious narrative since day one. Backing this propaganda effort has often been a team of sophists masquerading as historians who've worked tirelessly to correlate the lies into an overarching narrative that passes the smell test. Millions of man-hours, billions of dollars, legions of apostles and historians paid by the church have waged an all-out information war against independent researchers with nothing more than a drive to search, learn, and teach. For those of us who are independent researchers, the battle isn't fair, and we know it. We're outgunned, we're outnumbered, we're outclassed, and we're underfunded. We don't have missionaries. We don't have emotive hymns. We don't have threats of punishment in the afterlife. We don't have familial indoctrination and coerced compliance. We don't have monetary extortion based on salvation and correlated lesson manuals and armies of members who push those manuals every Sunday and most weekdays in seminary. But we have one soldier in this battle who is and remains undefeated. Information. The sanitizing light of information is an ally who never tires, never sleeps, and never retreats. This ally won't shoulder the entire war for us, but it will never let us down if we show unyielding loyalty to it. More information will always hurt the correlated narrative of Mormonism because it relies on suppression of information to survive. Information with the reinforcement squad of skepticism will be our scout, attack, and defense force as this war of information rages on. Nothing short of total and complete iconoclasm will shatter this edifice of lies. Over the next 10 weeks, we're going to explore the history of Mormonism the church refuses to teach. We'll discuss stories within this religion and its founder, Joseph Smith, which tell a more complete narrative of this controversial figure and the cult that he founded. Joseph Smith didn't just translate the Book of Mormon, build a temple, get thrown in jail because of religious persecution, and then get shot and died as a martyr. There's so much more, and the greatest sin against any historical figure is reducing their humanity down to a pathetically simplistic narrative to sell a religion. Praise to the man who communed with Jehovah is what we sing as children before we even know what any of those words means. So today begins the first of 10 episodes of Mormon history. We're going to cover the 4 main geographies of Mormon operation: New York, Kirtland, Ohio, Missouri, and Nauvoo, Illinois. Each of these locations contains numerous stories to highlight and examine through different lenses, and each of the first 7 episodes in our 10-episode series will be doing just that. The church began in New York under Joseph Smith. Greener grass beckoned the prophet to Kirtland, Ohio, where he joined with Sidney Rigdon and constructed a pseudo-democratic religious empire. Money troubles and dissent from within forced the prophet out of Ohio to Missouri, where the church had a foothold from its earliest days. But war and the resulting extermination order sent the Mormons packing to Nauvoo, Illinois, where Joseph Smith successfully constructed a theocratic empire, sovereign in its power and overt in its draconianism. This empire kept him and his closest friends safe in their criminality for years as they planned the overthrow of the world, until vigilante justice left the prophet and 2 of his brothers dead and his church without a supreme leader, inciting a multiple decades-long schism crisis spawning hundreds of child religions in existence today. With the battlefield and our path through it laid ahead, let's begin where it all started, with the young man responsible for starting Mormonism. Joseph Smith grew up in a very poor family who were largely uneducated. An important point to make here is education and intelligence are different things. They're often correlated, but uneducated people can be smart, and people with lots of degrees can be insufferable morons. Joe's parents, Lucy Mack and Joseph Smith Sr., married in 1796. According to Lucy's family history, her brother Stephen gave her a wedding gift of $1,000. But as a harbinger of future events, Joseph Sr. lost the entire amount when he got suckered into an investment scam. He spent a bunch of money buying ginseng and then arranged to export that ginseng to China. His business partner, who was known as a Mr. Stevens, ran off to Canada with the entire proceeds of this business deal, leaving Joseph Sr. with $1,800 in debt, shouldered by the entire Smith family. They sold their farm, which was worth about $1,500, for just $800 to cover a portion of this debt. The other $1,000 came out of Lucy's wedding gift, leaving the newlyweds with nothing. The impacts of this situation are far-reaching because, I would speculate, the lesson that little Joey took from his dad getting scammed with all this money, leaving the family destitute, was that there are 2 kinds of people in the world: those who cheat and those who get cheated. Lucy's father ended up letting the newlyweds rent part of his Vermont farmland for a while until they could get back up on their feet. Then they moved to New Hampshire, where Joe Jr. had one of the most traumatic experiences of his life. At the time, there was a terrible epidemic of typhoid. If only they would have worn their masks. And his sister, Sophronia, almost died in it. All of the kids in the Smith family caught it, and it was a really hard time for the entire Smith family, running Lucy absolutely ragged, trying to keep all of her kids alive. The illness resulted in Joe growing abscesses on his shoulder and his leg, the latter so bad that doctors wanted to amputate his leg. Thanks to an experimental medical procedure and Lucy's vehement advocacy for her son's future, Joe got to keep the leg, but he underwent an excruciating surgery without anesthetic and walked on crutches for a year. Amputation in the 19th century meant damnation to a life of vagrancy and begging. It's a harsh reality that Lucy knew, and she wanted better for her son. The family moved back to Vermont, where they had many more financial failures. Extremely cold winters destroyed their crops 3 years in a row, and they barely managed to have enough crusty bread to feed the kids. Finally, they decided to move to Palmyra, New York, for better weather. Lucy had to sell everything they owned in order to pay their debts before they left, and Joe Sr. had to borrow more money to pay for a wagon to carry them to New York. Lucy's family history says she arrived in Palmyra with 2 cents in cash. Joe Sr., or Big Daddy Cheese, as we call him on the show, went ahead and looked for a job and for some land while Lucy brought the kids and their few remaining possessions, with some troubles during the journey. The coach that they hired was piloted by a drunkard who tried to double charge them. Lucy commandeered the coach and brought her family to New York, driving it herself. Their first year in New York, they apparently did all right, mostly because Lucy started a successful business to decorate furniture with painted oilcloth, a source of income for nearly her entire life. Joe Sr., Big Daddy Cheese, and his sons built a cabin, and they cleared some farmland by felling trees on a small plot. But the second year, they barely made their mortgage payment. Lucy says they were, quote, destitute of money, property, or acquaintance, end quote. The only reason they were able to keep the farm was because the eldest son, Alvin, worked himself to the bone, earning money to pay the mortgage. Alvin managed to stabilize his parents' finances and started building them a nicer house by 1824, but then he got sick and died, leaving the family without its primary provider. So what was Joe's dad, Big Daddy Cheese, doing during all this time? Well, he and his sons worked as laborers for a local farmer named Jeremiah Hurlburt, but their relationship with him broke down and they ended up suing each other. Joe Sr. also ran a cake and beer shop out of the house, and he and his sons sold the beer and baked goods out of a little cart that they pushed around town during the summers. But unfortunately, Joe Sr. dabbled a little too deep into company stock. Neighbors like Barton Stafford and Isaac Butts said that Big Daddy Cheese was a quote-unquote noted drunkard. Neighbor Lorenzo Saunders even told a story about Joseph Sr. getting drunk at the pub and bragging about how big his dick was. Apparently, the other drunks tried to measure it and pushed a ruler through the seat of his pants. Historian Dan Vogel straight out calls Joseph Sr. an alcoholic, and we're going to discuss that further in another episode in this series. The Smith men mostly did odd jobs, and they didn't have a very stable source of income or even that great of a reputation in the neighborhood. Episodes 1, 10, 11, 12, 16, and 20. One of the odd jobs they did was money digging. At night, they would go out and dig for Indian springs and old Spanish mines or chests of pirate gold and other treasures. Now, this may seem insane to us, but there was a whole treasure digging culture in New York and the whole New England area, and a whole genre of stories about treasures who were guarded by spirits and ghosts. Episodes 152 and 153. The common practice of treasure diggers was to hire a diviner or a seer in order to locate the treasure, and then a conjurer or a necromancer in order to bind the spirit so that they could get the treasure before the binding spell broke. But if you committed some error in that ritual, like speaking out of turn, or placing the iron or witch hazel rods in the wrong place, or speaking the incantation or binding spell incorrectly, or performing the spell under the wrong governing planet, or myriad other simple errors, the spirit would whisk away the treasure and cause it to sink. Those damn ground gnomes are really elusive. Understandably, the treasure digging group almost always committed some error, or they didn't account for some variable, and the treasure that they were digging for would be lost. Usually, the conjurer still managed to walk away with a little bit of pocket money from the person who hired them to begin with. These diggers themselves were probably comprised of some folks who understood that it was all a con, and others who truly believed that they'd eventually get the money located by the seer or the diviner. I'm not sure exactly how to say that word. However, other aspects of treasure digging were unabashedly a con. Treasure digs were a fantastic way to launder counterfeit money, accusations which plagued Joseph Smith for much of his public life and contributed to his assassination in Carthage jail. Historian Dan Vogel, in his biography of Joseph Smith, has laid out really well how these conjurers basically were con artists preying on naive farmers by leading them on with the promise of treasure. And Joe got pretty good at this hustle, probably under the watchful eye of Big Daddy Cheese, his dad, and other mentors who were equally steeped in the occult traditions. Joe developed a reputation in the neighborhood for being a powerful seer. Episode 10. About 1823, he started telling stories about a golden book that was buried somewhere in the neighborhood, an ancient record written on golden plates. One of the last things that Joe's oldest brother, Alvin, said to Joe before he died, quote, "Do everything that lies in your power to obtain the record," end quote. With Alvin gone, Joseph Sr. drunk half the time, and Lucy at home trying desperately to support 10 kids, Joe's treasure-digging con offered a potential way to feed the family. Here's one example of what these look like. And this is from a neighbor named William Stafford. According to Stafford, the Smiths, quote, "devised a scheme by which they might satiate their hunger with the mutton of one of my sheep. They had seen in my flock of sheep a large, fat, black wether. Old Joseph and one of the boys came to me one day and said that Joseph Jr. had discovered some very remarkable and valuable treasures, which could be procured only in one way. That way was as follows: that a black sheep should be taken onto the ground where the treasures were concealed, that after cutting its throat it should be led around a circle while bleeding. This being done, the wrath of the evil spirits would be appeased, the treasures could then be obtained, and my share of them was to be fourfold. To gratify my curiosity, I let them have a large fat sheep. They afterwards informed me that the sheep was killed pursuant to commandment, but as there was some mistake in the process, it did not have the desired effect. This, I believe, is the only time they ever made money digging a profitable business," end quote. This language that Stafford used here is super important, pursuant to commandment. And the wether being black, particularly, those are both important ingredients to Christian occult magic. The lamb was to be used as basically the scapegoat for cleansing the diggers of any of their sins. They would cast their sins into the wether, sacrifice it by slitting its throat, and then spread its blood in a circle around the location of the buried treasure, thus binding the treasure and its spirit guardian to the location long enough for them to dig it out and then cast the guardian spirit off from the treasure. This is deeply rooted in Israelite Torah tradition of sacrificial offerings, and they probably burned the lamb as an offering once it had been bled out and then consumed the now kosher meat. D. Michael Quinn's Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview deals with this synthesis of Christian beliefs and occult traditions. This is from page 70, quote, "No known denunciation of the family ever used the phrase faculty of a brack, even though Lucy Mack Smith did. Neighbors accused Joseph Jr. and Sr. of practicing certain treasure-digging ceremonies, and it was Lucy Smith who used the phrase, linking these accusations to ritual magic. Mormon historian Richard L. Bushman observed that thereby Lucy revealed a knowledge of magic formulas and rituals. One Palmyra resident reported that the prophet's mother also performed various forms of magic divination, including palmistry. Marvin S. Hill has concluded, in her mind, magic circles, soothsaying, and other magical arts were one with her religious activities," end quote. And even the dagger they used in slitting the throat of the lamb had magical significance. Once again from Quinn, quote, "The Hiram Smith family has preserved as an heirloom the kind of dagger necessary for ritual magic," end quote, which Quinn actually prints a picture of that exact dagger in his book, Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview. Now, today's perspective of the occult being tied to Satanism and evil spirits and Dungeons and Dragons, that's a modern perspective. The division between white and black magic was highly observed by Joe and the family in order to be shown the gift and power of God in all of their endeavors, including treasure digging. Any biblical sins like adultery or fornication out of wedlock, debauchery, all of those were seen as habits and sins, vicious habits and sins, which needed to be cleansed in order for the human spirits to have any power over the ancient spirits which guarded the treasure. The question then becomes, did Joe really believe in this magic? Or was it all just a con? And I think that's a false dichotomy because both can be true. He made his meager living from, clearly conning people with the hopes that one day the treasure that they finally acquired would get him rich. Enough failed digs, however, will produce more deliberate cons to pay the bills. These cons weren't confined to Joe alone, as his dad had taught him the ways of a juggler magician from a very young age. So when Joe got a job to go hunt for treasure in Pennsylvania for a guy named Josiah Stowell who offered him high wages, guess who decided to come along to help, leaving his farm and family unattended in order to chase the treasure? None other than the village drunk Joseph Smith Sr., Big Daddy Cheese. Unfortunately, the next mortgage payment was coming up, and the creditors came around and started asking questions. Apparently, Joe and his dad had left Joe's brother, Hiram, in charge of the farm during their absence, and Hiram allegedly was cutting down the maple orchard and burning fence rails for fuel. A guy named Russell Stoddard, who wanted to buy the farm, notified the Smiths lender about all of this that was going on, and the lender evicted the Smiths from their farm and home well before the mortgage payment deadline. Lucy and the kids moved into Hiram's little cabin nearby. The Smiths started canvassing all of their friends and neighbors for help, and fortunately they found someone who agreed to buy that farm and let them stay for 1 year in exchange for 6 months labor on his farm by Joe's younger brother, Samuel Smith. At this point, the Smiths became renters instead of owners. And when Lucy writes about all of this in her family history from 1845, she reports that they were just absolutely devastated. It was, mostly persecution for what they were doing. Now, here's one more anecdote that illustrates just how poor the Smiths were. Now, Stephen Harding once visited their little shack in Palmyra during the typesetting of the Book of Mormon after it was written. Joe's mother, Lucy, served him milk, rye bread, and raspberries for dinner, and then she lit a tin candlestick so that they could read to him from the manuscript of the Book of Mormon. As she lit the candle, she remarked, "This is the only candle I can find in the house. I thought I had two, but maybe the rats has eat it up." According to Harding, the candle that she did light was used up by 10 p.m. They were incredibly poor. So take a step back and consider this family culture in which Joe grew up. Joe's psychology and his obvious urgency about making money was an ever-present driving factor in his day-to-day life. His family was dirt poor. Not only did they have no cash on hand, but they didn't own property, and their reputation in the community was such that no sane person would give them any credit by which to begin to extricate themselves from this destitution. Joe grew up on scraps, clothed in rags. In fact, Big Daddy Cheese in the late 1810s actually spent 30 days in a debtor's prison when Joe wasn't even a teenager yet, for failing to fulfill the obligations of a business contract. The only way the Smiths were able to afford their Manchester farmhouse was because Alvin Smith's industrious fortitude made him able to pay the first 2 payments as co-signer for the land deed. Alvin Smith, the oldest son of the family, had to co-sign for his parents' property. Alvin Smith, in many ways, was a bulwark for the family, a sturdy foundation around which the family could build some semblance of a normal life. And his mysterious death in 1823 wasn't just devastating because the family lost their eldest son. His death completely damned any prospect of the Smith family getting out of poverty. They were poor partly through their own fault, and, Joe's dad being an alcoholic and a moronic businessman, that certainly exacerbated these problems. But the story they told about themselves, about why they were poor, was that people kept cheating them for no reason. They'd gotten cheated out of the ginseng deal, and then Russell Stoddard had cheated them out of their farm. When people... It's a problem of perspective. When people speculate with excess wealth, they don't often run into danger of losing their only home or not feeding their family. But when people like the Smiths speculate with the little money that they need to feed themselves the way that Big Daddy Cheese did, they're gambling with money they don't have to spare, and the losses are far more immense and acutely felt. Joe figured out that the only time that he'd really made good for his family was when he was the one doing the cheating. You're either the cheater or the cheated, so he made a career out of cheating people for the rest of his life. In 1824, just 2 years after Harriet Tubman was born, a Christian revival rolled through town. Now, this wasn't uncommon, as many preachers had essentially celebrity status. Now, if you will, dear listener, picture this scene. Joseph Smith, at the age of 18, knows nothing but poverty, and of course all of the social consequences attendant with being stuck in the cycle of poverty. During this revival, a well-dressed man spends hours expounding on Bible passages to a crowd of hundreds of people. And that preacher, he seems very comfortable. The townfolk greet him eagerly, and he pays them in nothing but smiles and a few hours of sharing his wealth of knowledge. He's not only well-dressed, but he's also well-respected. After he finishes his hours of preaching, a collection plate passes around the crowd, and people pull money out of their pockets and put it in the plate. By the time the plate hits the end of the crowd, there's possibly a few $100s in there. The preacher then takes that money, thanks the people, telling them their offerings to the Lord or the widow's mite, and they'll be blessed for it. And then the guy hops into a chartered carriage and moves on to the next town to repeat the cycle. For a young man growing up in poverty at the age of 18 to see revival preachers with tailored suits and their entourages of followers fawning over them, it must have had a dramatic impact on the would-be, soon-to-be prophet. Joe was on the precipice of manhood, and when that's when he'd be expected to marry and to have children and to provide for his family, all while helping out his aging parents who were in destitution and his younger siblings, because Alvin was gone by this time. Sitting in the congregation and watching that collection plate circulate the crowd with enough money to keep the Smith family fed for months, what a dream it would be to have that plate coming to young Joe instead of that finely clothed priestcraft up on the stage. It's in this context that Joe supposedly had his famous first vision, in which God appeared to him in a pillar of light above the brightness of the sun and planted the seeds of the idea to start a new religion. Now, these visionary experiences that Joe had were incredibly common at the time, because this was the burned over district during the Second Great Awakening. Rick Grunder, a historian and rare book and document collector, published in the late 2000s a book titled Mormon Parallels, which documents well over 2,000 pages of what the title says, parallels to Joe's story and theology. This is from the introduction to Grunder's book. Quote, "Most of the seeds of Joseph Smith's texts and prophecies enjoyed popular cultural dissemination in forms familiar to non-Mormons before they grew into scripture of the latter day. In surprising depth and degree, much of what Mormonism presents as if it were its own actually flourished at various levels of society before Joseph Smith declared it. Enough solid evidence of this is now documented in reliable modern Mormon parallels. reasonably to suggest the presence in Joseph Smith's natural environment of the small portions that remain for us to discover, end quote. And throughout Grunder's work, we see hundreds of stories with similar tendencies to Joe's first vision. Grunder also notes in his introduction that, quote, Joseph went to his grave only pledging, never delivering, the great organic whole of Platonic theology. Indeed, Joseph's doctrinal pilgrimage was not direct progress from truth to further enlightening truth. Just as often, it was modern scripture contradicting modern scripture, revelation changing revelation. Joseph progressed along roads that were already well-traveled and varied, end quote. Now, Grunder here in that portion of the introduction taps into a concept worth highlighting. As Joe attended this 1824 revival, among many others he probably attended, he wasn't just realizing how posh the life of a circuit rider preacher could be. He was scoping out the potential market competition. If Joe was to compete, he must be more. If he was to rise above, he must be greater. If he was to take the headlines, he was to be more controversial. If he was to garner a following, he must be a better leader than others. More. Joe's experiences throughout the early to mid 1820s shaped his mind into what he would become and pulled together all of these cultural elements into what became his religion. Meanwhile, during all of this, he made a little bit of money as a treasure digger, and one of these stories that he told was about a gold Bible that he found. Now, if you want to stand out from all of these other preachers, your claims have to be truly remarkable, even to the point of unbelievable. A rich farmer named Martin Harris, or not so smarty Marty, dum as we call him, was a bit of a religious nut, and he got excited about the gold Bible story. Joe experimented a little bit by asking Marty to help him out with $50 for the project, and Marty forked that money over. And how Joe was able to get that money from Martin is quintessential con man. Joe knew that Marty was rich, so he walked up to Marty one day and said that God told him the first honest man that he met that day would give him $50. So either Marty gives him the money, or he's not an honest man in God's eyes. The manipulation tactics oftentimes were so simple, yet so effective. Now, Joe knew he had a sucker on the line in Martin Harris, and he reeled him in. He received a revelation asking Marty to pay the full cost of printing 5,000 copies of the Book of Mormon to the tune of $3,000. In order to come up with that money, Marty mortgaged his farm, and Joe promised to pay him back out of the profits from the book sales. In order to do that, Joe set the retail price of the book at $1.75. And if they had actually sold all of the books at the price, then there would have been like $5,700 to split at profit. That was a ton of money back then. But $1.75 was a big ask at the time when most books could be picked up used for a penny or two. But the Books of Mormon didn't sell. They had to drop the price, and then Joe decided that Marty was too wicked to be entitled to a share of the profits anyway. So Marty never did get his money back, and he eventually lost the farm and his abused wife in the process. And I say good for her. Episodes 3, 4, and 95. Once the religion started, the surplus of Books of Mormon ended up being traded as a commodity themselves. Joe's first counterfeit money was actually a counterfeit history that he claimed was scripture. So Joe wrote the Book of Mormon and he started to get it printed, but then Marty got cold feet about making that final payment to the printer. And that's when Joe received Book of Commandments, chapter 16, which is modern day Doctrine and Covenants, section 19. Quote, "Thou shalt not covet thine own property, but impart it freely to the printing of the Book of Mormon." End quote. Marty, again, believing that Joe was speaking for God, obeyed this commandment and forked over the money. And not long after this, Joe received another revelation about money. In the so-called Canadian copyright revelation, Joe commanded some of his buddies to go to Canada and sell the Book of Mormon's Canadian copyright for some quick cash because God had decided to let them all enjoy the quote-unquote temporal blessings of the holy work. Now, that mission failed, and Joe ended up having to retract the revelation and admit that it was either of man or of the devil. The text of that revelation was probably destroyed if it was ever written down in the first place, so all we have is later statements of the men who actually went to Canada in order to try and sell the Book of Mormon copyright. Once the Book of Mormon was understood to be a financial flop and it wasn't going to make Joe the money that he was always chasing, a new strategy had to be devised. He started to realize that the Book of Mormon wasn't going to make him that $1 million, but it might make him 1 million followers. Guess what followers have? Money! More followers makes more money, especially if tithing becomes a requirement. But he also realized that he had allowed some of his followers a little too much authority and a little too much freedom to challenge him. If you're going to run a successful con, you have to control the situation. You see what I did there? All right, I'll see myself out. So Joe had to deal with the logistical constraints of this con, right? He had made a few bold claims, and you can tell people that you speak for God when a few people will believe you. That's pretty great. But when you claim that you translated an ancient history of Christian Israelite settlers of America from a book made of gold, people are going to ask questions. If you show the Mark, who you're trying to convince of this con, a set of forged metal plates, you have to be able to control that person's access by doing something like putting it in a box or hiding it under a sheet or something. You have to be able to control that person's interpretation by describing the object to them, and you have to be able to control what they are and are not allowed to say to other people about what they see. You can't let that Mark investigate too much or ask too many questions, or your story may start to fall apart. The number of questions has to be limited because the answers to those questions have to go just far enough to let the phrase "you just have to have faith" pick up the slack, but not far enough that a person will ask more questions that you can't answer. Pretty early on in the church, Joe started establishing total control over his followers. And it began even before he made his set of plates. In the early 1820s, Joe thought that he might partner with other local treasure diggers, and apparently he promised them shares of the gold plates, but then he cut them out of it. After he claimed to have obtained the plates, they ransacked his parents' barn in an attempt to find the plates and get their slice of the gold plate pie. In fact, the seer stone that Smith used to locate and then translate the plates, quote unquote, translate by the gift and power of God, that stone itself was borrowed, in scare quotes, from a neighbor named Willard Chase, who found the stone while he was digging for a well. When Chase asked Joe to return that seer stone, Joe refused. Joe also once showed a magician named Samuel Lawrence where the plates were buried, and Lawrence viewed the plates through his own seer stone and noticed some spectacles that were buried there with the plates as well. And Joe incorporated the spectacles into his story, and they eventually became the Urim and Thummim, but he also feared that he had lost control of the narrative by bringing Lawrence in. So he dropped Lawrence from the project as well and claimed that he had shown Lawrence the wrong spot. Episode 9. After he made the plates and he authored the Book of Mormon, Joe went through similar processes of consolidating power over his followers. Initially, he made it sound like everyone could receive revelation just like him, and maybe he would allow some of his followers to collaborate with him in founding and leading the church. But then he started to feel like he was losing control again, and he changed his tune. Episodes 8, 18, 19, and 22. This began a pattern in Joe's ministry. He would grant offices within the church which retained some level of autonomy and control. As soon as the people within those offices overstepped Joe's arbitrary boundaries, he'd walk back their power, or he would manufacture a new office above them and place himself in that new elevated position. Episodes 23 and 25. In June 1829, the year Andrew Jackson was inaugurated, such a great time for America, Joseph Smith received a revelation for David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery, two of his closest followers, telling them that, quote, "I speak unto you even as unto Paul mine apostle, for you are called even with that same calling with which he was called, end quote. Now, that revelation is interesting for a couple of reasons. First, because neither David nor Oliver had been ordained to the office of apostle. The office of apostle didn't even exist in Mormonism at the time. In fact, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament wasn't ordained either. And in Galatians, he made a big point of the fact that he didn't need to be ordained. So the comparison of Oliver and David to the Apostle Paul implies that they have authority without any need for ordination. And secondly, the comparison to Paul also implies that David and Oliver have authority to write scripture, just like Paul did. In fact, Oliver didn't just believe he could receive written revelations, he actually did write some. According to an early convert named Ezra Booth, who left the church in 1831, Oliver, quote, did in fact issue some written productions, which he said bore the divine impress, but Smith fixed upon them the stamp of devilish, end quote. As a sort of compromise to this, Oliver, you can write revelations. No, those are devilish revelations. So as kind of a compromise, Smith told Cowdery that he, quote, was permitted to speak or to teach at all times by way of commandment unto the church, but not to write them by way of commandment. Thus, Cowdery is authorized to give verbal commandments to the church by the inspiration of the Spirit, which, if he afterwards writes, ceases to be inspiration. Therefore, a commandment delivered orally may be divinely inspired, but the same communicated written verbatim so far loses its former character that it degenerates into a production of an infernal stamp. Here is a mystery, for aught I know, peculiar to Mormonism, and none but Mormonites, I presume, will attempt to unravel it. End quote. So Oliver Cowdery, or Cowdung all over, yeah, I'm still not proud of that one, was briefly given the blessing to write scripture. As soon as it became a threat to Joe's power, Joe's blessing was revoked, and Cowdery could only speak by way of commandment. But as soon as he wrote it down, it was infernal. That's episode 22. It's, when we think about it, it's just patently absurd. But if we consider this from a naturalistic perspective, there is a finite amount of power within any social structure, like Mormonism or like any religious movement or any type of government structure or anything like that, right? Joe wanted the power all to himself. And when Oliver Cowdery stepped over boundaries, he had to reel in Cowdery's power. Now, some revelations written by David Whitmer's brother-in-law, Hiram Page, also contributed to Smith cracking down on this stuff. At this point in his career, like this is in the early New York era, right? Joe was receiving all of his revelations through the seer stone that he had stolen from Willard Chase. Joe often talked about that seer stone as if the power of revelation resided in the stone, not in himself. Oddly enough, Joe's early movement showed some democratic tendencies because he insisted that anyone who had the right stone or had a stone like his, they could also produce revelations. But this became a problem because Hiram Page had a seer stone of his own, and he started producing written revelations for the church the way that Oliver Cowdery had. Now, we don't know much about Hiram Page's revelations, except that they gave instructions regarding the order of the church and the location of Zion, the New Jerusalem, and Joe considered them to be, quote, unquote, entirely at variance with his own revelations. In Doctrine and Covenants, section 28, which Joe received in September of 1830, this is still the New York era, he commanded that, quote, no one shall be appointed to receive commandments and revelations in this church, excepting my servant Joseph Smith, Jr., for he receiveth them even as Moses, end quote. And the power grab was complete. Everyone else was just a spokesman like Moses' brother, appointed to parrot Joseph's words to the rest of the church. Joe declared Hiram Page's revelations satanic, and he had them burned, and he had Page's seer stone destroyed by grinding it into dust and scattering the stone to the wind. And to add insult to injury, Joe commanded Oliver Cowdery to be the one who delivered that verdict that those revelations are satanic to Hiram Page. That's Ollie's brother-in-law. Joe had slapped down Oliver, and now he made Oliver be the one to slap down Hiram Page. I mean, you talk about manipulative, right? Like, Joe really knew how to break a person's spirit and to crush the earliest seeds of a revolt, which would serve him very well as his church grew and expanded. Episodes 8 and 23. So to bring us into the Kirtland period of Mormonism, let's look at just one more example. In late 1830, this is the first year of the church existing, a small group of missionaries, including Oliver Cowdery and Parley Parker Pratt, who we call P Cubed, converted a Baptist congregation in Kirtland. And then Joe moved there in early 1831 and made it his new church headquarters, the greener grass, right? And he quickly established dominance over the former Baptists there and relegating their former minister, Hingepin Sidney Rigdon, to the same spokesman role that he had given to Cowdery and Whitmer, episode 24. Once Joe teamed up with Hingepin Sidney Rigdon, everything accelerated. Rigdon's followers, by and large, converted to Joe's church, providing a much-needed membership injection of restorationists who were hell-bent on building Zion, the New Jerusalem. With great new membership comes great new responsibility, and Joe needed to create new roles to rein in and control these new converts. Now, Kirtland got a little bit wild before Joe arrived, with lots of people getting the power of prophecy and revelation and receiving and writing down revelations and such. And we're going to discuss this a bit more on episode 3 of our series, where we're going to discuss all of that which is delicious to the taste and desirable. But there was one girl named Laura Hubble, from whom Rigdon had recognized as a prophetess and, quote, literally saluted her with what they called the kiss of charity, end quote. Now it's according to Ezra Booth again. When Joe arrived in February 1831, he, quote, declared her an impostor, end quote, and received a revelation that's now Doctrine and Covenants, section 43, reiterating that Joe was the only one appointed to receive revelations for the church, and that, quote, none else shall be appointed unto this gift except it be through him, end quote. So that was Joe's earliest power grab when he got to Kirtland. If he became a fallen prophet and lost his gift, the revelation that he gave there, in modern day D&C 43, that gave him the sole authority to appoint his replacement. In other words, the church is accountable only to Joe, and Joe is accountable only to God. No exceptions, period, full stop. Power grabs like this became very common as Joe's empire expanded, and he greedily aspired to be in the ultimate leadership position over his religion. And soon after his arrival to Kirtland, Joe firmly established the principle that only he was allowed to receive written revelations for the church, and that all the other church leaders were just his salespeople, spokespeople, same thing. But he hadn't really justified or institutionalized his power from a divine source yet, so that became his primary focus early on in Kirtland, episodes 19, 22, 24, and 25. Now, Mormon theology today divides the priesthood into two orders, Aaronic and Melchizedek. According to Joseph Smith's 1838 history, 1838, this is 8 years after he started the church when he started writing his history, right? Joe and Oliver Cowdery, first learned about these two different priesthoods, the Aaronic and Melchizedek, in May of 1829. As the story goes, first, the biblical John the Baptist appeared as a resurrected angel to Joe and Ollie and ordained them to the lesser or Aaronic priesthood. Then, some undetermined time later, the biblical disciples Peter, James, and John also appeared as resurrected angels and ordained Joe and Ollie to the higher or Melchizedek priesthood. Now, if you've ever been a member of the LDS Church, you probably know this story, right? Missionaries will tell you this story. What you probably don't know is that it never happened. Joe made the whole thing up later, which is really funny because this discrepancy in the historical record has caused a lot of headaches for apologists who need this concept of a full priesthood restoration to have occurred in May of 1829. What happened in May of 1829 is that Joe and Ollie baptized each other and then ordained each other to the office of elder. That's it. No John the Baptist, no Peter, James, and John, no greater and lesser priesthood. That's it. Those were all later fabrications. Every time Joe retold this story, he added more details and more embellishments that eventually transformed the story into what it is today, that he began recording in 1838 that wasn't published until 1842. Those offices and the arbitrary lines between the priesthoods and the high priesthood and the apostles and bishops and all of those concepts and all those offices and stuff, all of those hierarchical structures of the church today, they evolved slowly out of necessity, spurred by Joe's desire to stay on the highest level of his expanding religious pyramid. Now, according to early Mormon apostles, David Whitmer and William E. McClellan, these details did not exist in the earliest versions. They weren't even apostles until after Zion's camp in 1834. That's episodes 30 and 31. In an 1885 interview, D-Day David Whitmer said, quote, "I never heard that an angel had ordained Joseph and Oliver to the Aaronic priesthood until the year 1834, 5, or 6, end quote. And in a couple of letters from the 1870s, William E. McClellan, we call him Professor Bill, because he was a smart guy and he was a really strong record keeper and he taught school. William McClellan said that despite having heard Joseph Smith tell the story of the church's founding some 20 times, quote, "I never heard of John the Baptist ordaining Joseph and Oliver. I heard not of James, Peter, and John doing so. Today, I do not believe the story," end quote. Right there, we have our first red flag contradicting Joe and all his claims of angelic priesthood ordination, right? This priesthood restoration supposedly happened 5 years before D-Day David Whitmer first heard about it in Ohio in 1834, but nothing was said about it until 1834. Ollie and Joe supposedly had an angel of God, the same angel that baptized Jesus, descend from heaven and ordain them to the Aaronic priesthood by laying his ghostly, apparitive hands on their heads. And then after that, Peter, James, and John, the three heaviest hitter apostles of Jesus, supposedly descended and ordained Ollie and Joe to the Melchizedek priesthood. And Joe and Ollie apparently had personal experiences with the four most important people in all of Christology, aside from Jesus himself. And they didn't think it was necessary to mention it to D-Day David Whitmer, like on their weekend, their week-long journey from Harmony to Fayette, like 2 weeks after it supposedly happened. It didn't come to their mind. Like, how is that even possible? If it really did go down this way, wouldn't the priesthood ordination, wouldn't the appearance of these apostles in ghostly form, wouldn't that be the only thing that Joe and Ollie would ever talk about for like the entire time? This was supposed to be the event that the literal entirety of Mormon authority comes from, the restoration of the priesthood. And Joe and Ollie just forgot to mention it to the highest ranking church leaders until the mid-1830s? Half a decade after it happened? It just slipped their minds? Are you serious? Now, apologists will claim that Joe tailored the story of the priesthood restoration to different audiences for different purposes, and that the event was simply too sacred to tell some folks. Milk before meat and all that nonsense. But these were two guys, William McClellan and D-Day David Whitmer, who said they didn't hear about it until the mid-1830s. These are two guys in the highest ranking offices in the church, and there's absolutely no contemporary record that mentions the priesthood restoration until the mid-1830s. Now, You may say, Bryce, come on, I read about these angelic ordinations in Joseph Smith's history. That's in the Pearl of Great Price. That's scripture. Are you insinuating that Mormon scripture is somehow flawed? I read about the priesthood ordination in the Doctrine and Covenants too. It's section 27. It includes a long description of the angelic ordinations and the restoration of the priesthood, and that revelation is dated August of 1830. So that proves that the angelic ordination, this priesthood restoration, that proves that it dates to earlier than 1830, right? Right? Great. So then Whitmer and McClellan made a mistake, and Joe is vindicated. You're an anti-Mormon, Bryce. Yeah, you can say that thing. Sure, that's cool. You can say that. One thing, though, like, everything in section 27 of the Doctrine and Covenants about the angelic ordinations was added to the revelation years later. Joe also added lines to section 7 about priesthood authority. Listen to My Book of Mormon, episodes 101 and 110. Joseph Smith quietly went back and edited divine revelations supposedly from God to match whatever latest lie he was telling to make his own office of authority higher and higher in his own church that he created. Now, like, Mormons get super offended when people say, oh my God, because that's taking the Lord's name in vain, right? How vain do you have to be to say, I am speaking for God and he said this one thing, and then to go back and change what goddamn God said years after he said it to make a current lie true? The arrogance is appalling to me. And you wonder why other Christians think that Joseph Smith was an antichrist, right? This revisionism at the time caused problems for Joseph Smith because they were lies that people actually knew the truth of, and they're like, wait, what's going on here, right? Professor Bill McClellan, D-Day David Whitmer, and Oliver Cowdery, they all eventually left the church when these issues of authority became an issue for them. Well, they left the church, or they were excommunicated, and they were told that they had 2 days to leave town, or the Danites would be waiting outside the door. Episode 43. So they noticed that Joe was doing stuff like this, like changing the revelations, changing the words of God, and then making up new priesthoods. So why bother going to all of this trouble? Why did Joe take the risk of being called out on his facts and just manufacture stories about the restoration of the priesthood? It's simple. He had to explain where his authority came from in a way that could not be contradicted ever. If it came from him and Oliver just like, mutually baptizating and ordaining each other elder, then it's really hard to justify the idea that Joe has special authority divinely given to him from angels of the Lord, from like the 4 heaviest hitters in the Bible, and that everyone else needs to get that authority from him, that he needs to give that authority to those people. You see, priesthood keys aren't very useful if all doors to the religion are open with the same key. But even today, every man in the church, every man in the church, when they're given the priesthood, gets their little certificate, which traces their priesthood all the way back to that day in 1829. Even though it was a later fabrication. It was all a lie because Joe was so jealous of his power. But if it came from resurrected biblical apostles and there are structured priesthood orders with Joe at the head, well, that makes Joe the conduit of authority. And the hierarchy of priesthood offices becomes a kind of authority ladder that you can only climb by showing fealty to the one true prophet. Joe's insatiable palate for power was merely one aspect of his avarice, but money was also central to his plot. And money was what this was about from the beginning. And power comes with money. The two concepts go disturbingly hand in hand. Joe hatched all sorts of money-making schemes during his time in Kirtland, Ohio, mostly because he was super-duper addicted to shopping on credit. For instance, Joe built the Kirtland Temple on credit at the cost of about $40,000. To pay for it, he opened a mercantile store and bought somewhere between $80,000 and $90,000 worth of store goods on credit in New York. He also bought a steam mill and bought a bunch of expensive farms. And these businesses that were all bought on credit all eventually failed. To cover all of these losses, Joe introduced a kind of socialism to the church, asking people to sign over all of their property and all of their businesses to church ownership and to work their own farms as stewards for the benefit of the church. He also extracted donations from the members at every opportunity, and he sent missionaries out to bring people in to Kirtland, and then he sold city lots to the new arrivals at more than what he paid for them. Because most of them were just signed over to him. They were just given to the church. And then when people would come into Kirtland, he would sell the property to those people. Like, it's baffling too, because all of these businesses all eventually failed. Like, Joe was a terrible businessman, and it's abundantly clear that no amount of money was ever enough for him. Even bleeding his parishioners dry of nearly every cent they could muster wasn't enough for him, because let's be honest, most of those members were dirt poor to begin with, and that was before the Joe scourge hit Kirtland. Yet, Joe continued to spend money that he didn't have. At a time when the church was somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 in debt, that's about $1.3 million in 2020 money, Joe spent $8,000 to hire a Hebrew teacher to teach a 7-week course. A carpenter at the time made about $1 a day, maybe $1.50 a day. Joe paid this Hebrew teacher something like $163 a day. That was an insane amount of money in 1836. No professor who worked at Columbia or Oxford or Harvard at that time was making $163 a day. It's a crazy bonkers amount of money. It's so clear that Joe had no idea of the concept of money and what money really means, right? And he also bought some Egyptian mummies and papyri for like $2,400, which was like $2,000 more than their assessed price, like 6,000 times or 6 times the value of what they're supposed to be. But these mummies and papyri, they proved to be one of Joe's greatest blunders, because he declared that these papyri were the writings of Abraham and Joseph of Egypt before he actually bought them, which gave the broker, Michael Chandler, leverage to charge a lot more money for them. It's insane. Just bad decision compounding bad decisions. Fortunately for Joe, he was able to just borrow the $2,400 from a couple of his followers and then never pay it back. As the church neared 1835, these patterns were becoming increasingly taxing and burdensome on the Mormon membership. 1835 is also the year that Charles Darwin landed on the Galapagos Islands. So that's super cool. But all of this debt added up, right? The church edged towards bankruptcy by 1836. Like, you can't run a church without any money, right? And when that church has an overall debt gap of over $1 million of today's currency, there's no way of bouncing back. There's no exports. There's no way to vastly increase tithing income and vastly increase membership. Like, we're looking at some serious deficits that lead to serious problems. Joe got super desperate, and what he did next to help with the money problems, it was a bit of a last-ditch effort, which failed spectacularly. Here's Ebenezer Robinson's account of what happened from his autobiography. Quote, "A brother in the church by the name of Burgess had come to Kirtland and stated that a large amount of money had been secreted in the cellar of a certain house in Salem, Massachusetts, which had belonged to a widow, and he thought he was the only person now living who had knowledge of it or to the location of the house. His statement was credited by the brethren, and steps were taken to try and secure the treasure. We soon learned that 4 of the leading men of the church had been to Salem, Massachusetts in search of the hidden treasures spoken of by Brother Burgess, viz. Joseph Smith Jr., Hiram Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and Oliver Cowdery. They left home on the 25th of July and returned in September." End quote. That's right. Joe traveled hundreds of miles over more than 2 months to chase a story of buried treasure. That is classic Joe if I've ever heard it. Continue on with Ebenezer Robinson, quote, "We were informed that Brother Burgess met them in Salem, Massachusetts, evidently according to appointment, but time had wrought such a change that he could not for a certainty point out the house with the buried treasure, and soon left. They, however, found a house which they felt was the right one and hired it. It is needless to say they failed to find that treasure or the other gold and silver spoken of in the Revelation." End quote. After failing to get the treasure, Joe received a revelation in which God told him the divine purpose of the trip hadn't actually been to get worldly treasure, but to get spiritual treasure. Quote, "Concern not yourself about your debts." He's $1.2 million in debt, right? "Concern not yourself about your debts, for I will give you power to pay them." End quote. So Joe just ended up hanging out in Salem for a month and to do some missionary work and to I guess, try and allay the embarrassment of having made this treasure-digging trip for nothing. And then he returned home to Kirtland, Ohio. Joe the treasure digger got hoodwinked by a treasure digger. Now, Burgess, this guy, was hired by Joe using church funds while it was hopelessly in debt to help them find buried treasure to pay off that debt. Joe and friends made the trip. They went digging around without finding a single shekel while spending a fair amount of money to live in Salem for a month. Merely 10 years after Joe fraudulently told boss man Josiah Stowell that he knew where hidden buried treasure was and got himself hired to help find it and then ended up in court in 1826 for it, this guy Burgess did the same thing to Joe and his friends. You know, sometimes history gives us these little gems of poetic justice through irony. Episode 35. Robinson ends his discussion of this incident by saying, quote, "Failing to secure the Salem treasure and no demand for city lots, with their debts pressing heavily upon them, it evidently seemed necessary that some ways and means should be devised to extricate themselves from their present embarrassments. To this end, a banking institution was organized called the Kirtland Safety Society." End quote. Whether out of anger for the failure of this treasure-digging trip or simply conceived of through desperation, the Kirtland Safety Society, also known as the Kirtland Bank, was formed. The Kirtland Bank got its start on November 2nd, 1836. That's the same year that Thomas Crapper was born. So when people say that they're going to the Crapper, that guy's the reason, even though the word crap didn't actually originate with him. It's just one of those happy, crappy coincidences. Now, according to the History of the Church, Volume 2, on that date, November 2nd, 1836, quote, "The brethren at Kirtland drew up certain articles of agreement preparatory to the organization of a banking institution to be called the Kirtland Safety Society. President Oliver Cowdery was delegated to Philadelphia to procure plates for the institution." Those are printing plates. Metal plates that have the thing engraved that you stamp on paper, the printing plates, right? And Elder Orson Hyde to repair to Columbus with a petition to the legislature of Ohio for an act of incorporation, which was presented at an early period of their session. But because we were Mormons, the legislature raised some frivolous excuse on which they refused to grant us those banking privileges they so freely granted to the others. Thus, Elder Hyde was compelled to return without accomplishing the object of his mission, while Elder Cowdery succeeded at a great expense in procuring the plates and bringing them to Kirtland. End quote. So, look, the Mormons were desperately poor. Joe was running out of credit. Bills were way overdue. Joe decides to create a bank, and the first thing that he does is send Oliver Cowdery off to Philadelphia to get the printing plates done up for actually stamping and printing the money, right? The banknotes that they would be making. By the way, no, there are rumors about Joe's family having been involved in counterfeiting money all the way back to Vermont. So it's fully possible that he was just trying to take family money printing business legit with a state recognized bank charter. That's probably the kind of the mentality that went into this. But The legislature's decision to deny the bank a charter, which according to the history of the church was because they are Mormons and some frivolous excuse, which isn't true. But that decision to deny the bank charter, that caused a lot of problems. Cowdery had bought these expensive metal plates that had said Kirtland Safety Society Bank on them, but they had been denied a legal charter for a bank, so they couldn't legally print the money, right? In fact, according to Ebenezer Robinson, Cowdery returned to Kirtland with not only the metal plates to print the money, but also $200,000 worth of bank bills already printed, quote, which would be worthless unless some way could be devised by which they could be used, end quote. It was illegal to print money without a charter, and the state denied that charter, and Joe really needs money. He always needs more money. He can never have enough money, right? So how do they resolve this problem? Well, one of these geniuses, that's a fun word to use to describe these guys, one of these geniuses came up with a plan to have their counterfeit cake and to eat it too. They just incorporated their company as the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company. And then they hand-stamped anti before bank and ing co after bank on every single note. Boom. $200,000 worth of anti-bank notes redeemable at your local anti-bank. And only at that local anti-bank, because you couldn't use the money for anything else, right? They weren't printing money. They were simply printing certificates, which were as good as money, as long as the bank remained solvent and had enough capital specie to cover all of the printed money. But that would quickly become a problem because the banking company didn't have any investment capital. Joe and his buddies only had debt, which isn't a great place from which to start a business, especially a bank or, an anti-banking company. The Articles of Agreement for the anti-bank are absolutely hilarious. They declared the capital stock of the bank to be worth not less than, are you ready for it? $4 million. $4 million in 1836 money, which is about, just take a guess. Just take a guess. How much do you think that is in 2020 money? $108 million. They just declared that was the capital stock. They just wrote on a piece of paper that the Kirtland Safety Society had more than $1/10 billion and expect people to invest with that promise. Can you imagine going on Shark Tank and telling the sharks that you're going to start a bank with no capital, tons of debt, and you want them to buy in at a $4 million valuation? Are you serious? The articles also allowed the bank's 7 directors, including Joe himself, to be compensated without limit. Also, stockholders in the bank could, at any time, be required by the directors to pay in more money, which was really exploitative, right? Especially when Prophet Joseph Smith was telling his followers to invest in that bank because it was God's bank and it would, quote, swallow up all other banks on earth, end quote. That's a real quote from Joseph Smith. The whole Kirtland Bank, it's such a unique and incredible confluence of desperation, ignorance coupled with idiocy, deliberate dishonesty, and fraud, all driven by gluttony of money. It's such a remarkable time in Mormon history. And these guys, come on, they knew what they were doing. Like an investor who bought into Enron in August of 2000, right? Joe managed to start a bank just when the nation was peak bank and heading into the Panic of 1837, when hundreds of these private banks collapsed, which of course, legitimate chartered banks themselves collapsed, especially anti-banking companies that were just printing money also obviously collapsed. In March of 1837, President Andrew Jackson, on his way out of office, announced that the U.S. federal government would no longer accept paper money from private banks for purchasing land and for taxes. So this immediately devalued paper money that was issued by private banks, and it caused a run on banks across the country with people trying to redeem their paper banknotes for gold and silver coins. Lots of banks went out of business because they didn't have enough specie, and holders of their banknotes lost everything. This was the Great Depression 0.5, right? This was massively deflationary, and it sent the country into a 7-year depression. That's episode 38 to learn more. In Kirtland, the crisis of the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company collapsing was made a lot worse by the fact that some of the church's top leaders, including David Whitmer, Jacob Bump, Warren Parrish, decided that Joe was a false prophet because he prophesied that the bank could never fail. This, in addition to a number of other factors like the Fanny Alger incident and Joe's handling of the Missouri crisis, among tons of other issues. Now, these guys went around collecting banknotes and taking them to the Kirtland Safety Society Bank to redeem them for gold and silver, which couldn't be done because they had no capital investing into the company when they started it. Joe ended up just cutting his losses by resigning his directorship and putting a couple of fall guys in charge instead. And then he denied all responsibility for the bank's failure, which is what apologists used to say that he didn't know what he was doing at the time. He knew. Everybody knew what was really going on. And the dissenters obviously didn't buy this, right? Lyman Johnson, Orson Pratt, Warren Parrish, they brought charges against Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon in high council for lying and extortion, among other things. Parley P. Pratt, P. Cubed, gave a sermon railing against Joseph Smith for his sins attached to the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company. Creditors and law enforcement officers also started to come after Joe and to try and collect on all of his debts. Joe eventually got all of the dissenting apostles that were mad about this whole affair excommunicated. By the end of 1837, about 40 to 50 high-ranking dissenters had been excommunicated from the church, including Book of Mormon investor Martin Harris. Even not so smarty Marty, who got suckered into funding the Book of Mormon, recognized the Kirtland Bank as a money-making scam. The dissenters ended up founding their own church called the Church of Christ. They still believed in the Book of Mormon, but they rejected the prophet Joseph Smith and his own leadership. What that means, his own leadership essentially formed their own church and excommunicated Joe from their new Kirtland church after they formed it. Joe won the struggle for control of the church, but only marginally. But he did lose the struggle for control of the temple, which got foreclosed on and turned over to the Church of Christ. He also lost the struggle for control of the city. A court fined Joe and Rigdon each $1,000 for illegal banking practices, and an angry mob burned down the church's printing office. At least that's how the story is told. Far more salacious and disturbing versions of the events also exist. A man named Grandison Newell, who was owed a lot of money by Joe, claimed that Joe had attempted to assassinate him. The printing office that burned to the ground also didn't burn down until it had transferred ownership in the courts, and a guy in the early 1900s claims that his dad was instructed by the prophet to burn that printing press building down to keep it from falling into the hands of the apostates. This was a chaotic time in Kirtland for the prophet, so he and Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon fled Kirtland on December 22nd, 1837 under the cover of night and went to far west Missouri, where there was another branch of the church that was larger than the Kirtland church, and they did so in a wagon that Joe's faithful henchman, Bloody Brigham Young, had appropriated from a church member. From Kirtland to Missouri was a move spurned by desperation and death threats. Missouri had a larger church than what was in Kirtland, and Joe's lust for power upon his arrival in Missouri resulted in numerous excommunications, restructuring of the church leadership in Missouri, and then Joe beginning to write his own history. Now, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time in Missouri because Joe wasn't there for very long, and we'll have plenty more to say about the year of 1838 in Missouri in future episodes within this 7-episode review series. But the main things you need to know are that before Joe arrived, the Missouri Mormons had had years of conflict with the non-Mormon citizens in Missouri who had pushed the Mormons out of several different counties. Finally, those Mormons in Missouri had cut a deal that the Mormons would stay in Caldwell County and they could have that whole county to themselves as long as They didn't go and try to settle neighboring counties. That truce held and peace was maintained between the anti-Mormon Missourians and the Mormons until Joseph Smith arrived in town and immediately decided to break the truce and to start settling neighboring Daviess County. Now, William Swartzel was one of the settlers who was sent to Daviess County, complained about the unfair way that the land was allocated there. Church leaders, of course, got first pick of the land allocations. Quote, "The least among the brethren were the least noticed and got the least land," end quote. He also complained that the law of consecration made it impossible for anyone to leave the church if they had doubts, because if you left, then you forfeited all of the property that you had signed over to the church, and that left you destitute and penniless. The law of consecration made this an inevitable result. Once all your property is owned by the church or consecrated to the bishop's storehouse, it remains in the possession of the church if you leave. This may be the most brazenly greedy of all of Joe's revelations. So the Mormons' decision to break their promise with the Missourians to stay in Caldwell County, that led to a big fistfight in Daviess County on Election Day when the Mormon settlers turned out to vote as a bloc for their favorite political candidates who were friendly to the Mormons. And, of course, the non-Mormon citizens tried to stop them. The fight escalated into a war, and as part of that war, Mormon troops looted and burned some non-Mormon towns in Gallatin and Millport in Daviess County. When the Mormon soldiers first arrived in these towns, they claimed to have found them abandoned, the citizens supposedly having fled. According to Apostle Thomas B. Marsh, the milk strippings guy, quote, "The prophet, on hearing the property was left, commenced a reply and said, 'We had better see to it.' The same evening, a number of footmen came up from the direction of Millport, laden with property which I was informed consisted of beds, clocks, and other household furniture. During the same time, a company called the Fur Company were sent out to bring in fat hogs and cattle, calling the hogs bears and the cattle buffaloes," end quote. Episode 44. Now, granted, like, this is wartime, right? And stuff like this happens in war. Like, also, like, a lot of new Mormon immigrants had just arrived in Missouri and they needed food. But I'm not sure that justifies burning the towns and stealing stuff like clocks and beds and furniture, right? The same people who would defend Joe's actions here in looting and pillaging the non-Mormon settlements would also probably condemn the recent rioters who looted a Target after the death of George Floyd, right? Even though there are many similar forces at play. Notably, though, there's a powerful distinction, right? Because the Mormons here had scriptural justification for looting and burning those non-Mormon settlements. So let's say that's a pretty significant difference from what we're seeing in mid-2020. Joe's revelation from 1832 stating that the property of the Gentiles would be consecrated to the church gave these holy warriors all the reason that they needed to burn, plunder, and pillage their sinful Gentile neighbors. Episodes 45, 46, and 47. This all resulted in the surrender of the Mormon Twin Cities of Far West and Adamon-Diamond at the culmination of the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri and Hansville Massacre, and we'll be discussing all of that in coming episodes in this series. This landed Joe, Hiram, and many other church leaders in Liberty Jail and other Missouri prisons for months. Governor Lilburn Boggs signed the extermination order, and the next Mormon mass exodus commenced, this time to the receptive arms of Illinois, where they eventually built their own city, Nauvoo. When Joe arrived at what would become Nauvoo after his escape from Missouri, he almost immediately started in with land speculation, because of course he did. The Mormons needed a home, and if he could make some money off of them in the process, that's just gravy, right? That's just the milk strippings. So Joe bought huge swaths of land on both sides of the Mississippi near Nauvoo with the intention of turning around and selling that land back to Mormon converts who immigrated to Nauvoo. Joe and the other church leaders didn't purchase and lay out just one town site. They purchased and laid out several town sites. And this was a very ambitious real estate scheme with one massive flaw. Joe didn't have any capital. He himself was so incredibly far indebted, and he made all of these purchases on a 20-year payment plan with no down payment at interest of about 8% per year. he also apparently traded away some of the unwanted land deeds from Missouri and Ohio. The land deeds in Missouri were the promised land. They were Zion. They were going to build the new Jerusalem, the Mormon Jesus religious theocratic kingdom. Joe traded away that sacred hallowed ground. And beyond that, the Mormons had just been removed from their homes in Missouri, and they were exponentially destitute from the events of the previous 3 years, tracing all the way back to the Kirtland Banking Company. How do you build a city and make money on nothing more than credit off the backs of poor refugees? Well, Joe showed us that it could be done, but that only the most short-sighted of plans could keep that system running. There were no grand plans which would posture Nauvoo as an economic powerhouse that he dreamed it could become. It had the location and it had the industrious population to make it happen, to turn Nauvoo into a massive factory industry, metropolis. But the grand plans were never realized. It had that location, it had the people, but the ability to execute any long-term plans quickly fell away when short-term plans proved more appealing or provided for speedier gratification to the prophet and his pseudo-wealthy elite. Like a country running on a multi-trillion-dollar deficit and handing $500 billion to 500 extremely wealthy people. Like, that bill is going to come due eventually. According to Joe, quote, "When I made the purchase of the White and Galland, there were 1 storehouse, 3 frame houses, and 2 block houses, which constituted the whole city, and the place was literally a wilderness," end quote. So, he probably thought that he was getting in the ground level. It was super cheap and laying the groundwork to sell all this property that he was buying at higher prices once settlers started arriving and driving up property values. But in reality, Joe drastically overpaid for this much land. For some context, at this time, the average price for land was between $2.50 to $13 per acre nationwide. I mean, it widely varied. But in one purchase from Horace Hotchkiss, the divinely inspired prophet Joseph Smith, with the power of discernment, agreed to pay around $229 per acre. He paid around 32 times the expected market value at the most generous estimates. Another purchase from Isaac Allen may not have even been legal to begin with because the deeds were so hotly disputed. Episodes 53, 56, and 95. Part of Joe's plan to finance the land purchases was to lobby Congress for reparations for what they had just suffered in Missouri. So in 1839, he sent the Quorum of 12 Apostles on a mission to England to get more converts and to bring in more tithing, of course. And he had them stop along the way in Washington, D.C. to deliver petitions. Joe and his brother, Hiram Sidekick Abeth Smith, each believed that they should receive $100,000 apiece for what they had been through, for loss of properties and damages and, suffering. But of course, no reparations ever materialized. They never got a payout, a massive bailout from the government. Side note, the apostles, during this mission trip in 1839, they didn't take much money with them. So they had to beg from already poor, destitute Mormons along their route in order to pay for their passage all the way to England. Episodes 57, 58, and 61. While the apostles were headed on this crucial mission to Europe, Joe improved the area around his own house on Water Street in what was then Commerce, soon to be Nauvoo, very first. He improved his own little neighborhood very first. And if he was indeed the altruistic prophet for the people that he claimed he was, he would be living in a shack until every other Mormon had a brick home, but he did the exact opposite. And he knew what was going on, too. He knew that he was speculating on land values, and the people knew it just as much as him. He knew that these business deals, they may have been sold to the Mormons. He may have told them that it was by divine providence, but anybody with a brain in their skull knew that Joe was speculating on land, and these land speculators from which he was purchasing the land were largely setting Nauvoo's economic trajectory on a disaster path to serve their own love of money. Everybody, including the prophet, especially the prophet himself, was trying to get rich quick in the earliest days of Nauvoo by foisting hundreds of thousands in debt on the backs of the destitute Mormon refugees who had just been chased out of the state of Missouri because Joe had declared war on the state. Like, you have to be a special kind of malevolent to profiteer off this much pain and suffering. The thing is, Joe wasn't crazy to be optimistic about real estate prices. The Mormons did have a golden opportunity to turn Nauvoo into a sprawling metropolis with unrivaled access to the largest shipping river in the United States and to realize an incredible potential to become the next biggest manufacturing center in the state of Illinois. Add into that the fact that Nauvoo was surrounded by fertile farmland to sustain the population and to, get a whole bunch of crops and ship them up and down the Mississippi, right? Like, a bunch of land speculators had Nauvoo slated as the next Chicago with a massive influx of the Mormon population. A lot of people, including the prophet, had a somewhat realistic optimism for the future of the city and the money that they would make with Nauvoo growing so quickly. For comparison, the population of Chicago on the 1840 census was just under 4,500 people, whereas Nauvoo ticked in at a cool 2,500 people. Nauvoo briefly surpassed Chicago in population with the influx of Mormon refugees, climbing that population to around 12 to 15,000 by 1845. That was nearly double what Chicago was at that time. However, Nauvoo's population was mostly too poor to pay the high prices Joe was asking to recoup his costs and pay even the interest on his debts. The perpetual state of poverty Joe had run the Mormons and the church at large into wasn't an easy hole to dig themselves out of. And that state of poverty was a dark cloud overhanging the Mormons every moment during the struggling years of the Nauvoo settlement. And buying land with regular specie for the average Mormon was impossible. So credit was extended to them by Joe, who was operating on nothing but credit himself. The Mormons beginning their settlement efforts were already running in the red, and they had constructed their settlement on top of an ever-growing mountain of debt. Understandably, Joe used the land in his possession to issue favors to those who showed fealty to him. He exchanged choice property for demonstrations of loyalty like any good mafia boss. And like Joe just giving land to his buddies in exchange for goods or services led to extremely volatile land prices because Joe might pay like one guy an acre of Nauvoo land for a couple bushels of corn, and another guy would be paid an acre for like a few weeks worth of work of construction for the church. Joe's hunger for money at this time through land, it made it so he frequently placed himself as a middleman in every possible transaction, whether land or any other commodity. If any transaction was going on around town that could be brokered through land that he owned, he stood to make just a little bit of money from it, and he would seize that opportunity. But to make matters far worse, Joe didn't really like rules and regulations. There was no overseeing body or committee who were supposed to control the volatility of those land prices, nor did anybody with an education or background in economics serve as an advisor to the prophet. And if they did, they'd tell him bad news and he'd ignore them anyway. Joe was in control of everything, and he was named as trustee in trust, a manufactured title of all church assets and monetary affairs. Very early into the Nauvoo years, Joe made an utter and complete mess of things, keeping terrible records or no records at all, not recording his debts and assets with any reliable system, and having no standardized value for acreage. This only compounded the problems of exorbitant land prices for which he purchased the land to begin with. Essentially, Joe was making a ton of business transactions, but often wasn't worrying about all the bothersome paperwork to make things official. Just a gentleman's handshake with the sure sign of the nail agreement, and maybe a signed bill of sale, or maybe not, with the one true prophet. That was enough to allay most people's concerns. By mid-1840, the very beginning of the Irish potato famine, Joe knew how much of a tangled web Nauvoo finances were becoming, and he was trying to pass his own monetary problems off to the High Council. They knew just as much as he did, that nothing was in order and all debts assumed by the church were essentially Joe's own debts in his own name. So the High Council didn't want to get anywhere near the plutonium that was Joe's finances. So they just left Joe in charge, and he continued to make a mess and accrued more debt to nearly $200,000 in his name alone. His tangled web of finances remains unsolved and largely mysterious even to historians today. And understandably, after his death, the financial stress left on Emma to untangle her, her dead husband's assets from the quorum of the apostles' claimed church assets, that became a central catalyst of conflict between Emma and Bloody Brigham, episodes 72 and 95. Just like in New York and Kirtland, Joe's drive for money also ran hand in hand with his drive for power. The two are inextricably tied. Joe's drive for power in Nauvoo was absolutely ravenous, and it starts with the Nauvoo Charter, which Joe collaborated to write with Robert B. Thompson and John C. Reckitt Bennett in 1840. Now, the Nauvoo Charter was mostly a copy-paste from the Springfield, Illinois Charter, but with some modifications that gave the Mormons unique privileges. For instance, the Nauvoo Charter gives the city government exclusive power to regulate ferries, which Joe would eventually use to give himself a monopoly over the local ferry business because it was one of the few lucrative businesses in town that was bringing in outside money. It also designated the mayor as head of the city council and the mayor and city councilors as justices of the peace, thus combining executive, legislative, and judicial power in the person of the city mayor, which, of course, would be Joseph Smith, giving him powers that he greatly abused once Reckitt Bennett was ousted from the office of mayor. But the most important section in the Nauvoo Charter was Section 25, authorizing the creation of a large city militia called the Nauvoo Legion, making it answerable to the mayor and entitling it to the use of state armaments. The treason charges against Joe in Missouri concerning his, raising and maintaining an unauthorized militia and using his own unauthorized militia to fight the official militia state-sanctioned forces of the state of Missouri. This provision in the Nauvoo Charter, Section 25, assured that he wouldn't get in trouble for having his own militia ever again. Every good mafia boss dreams of having a state-sanctioned army at their command, but they rarely get it. Joe was exceptionally corrupt in many, many ways, including through military power. Episode 66, we read through the entire Nauvoo Charter and we discussed it and the ramifications extensively. So the Illinois state legislature, they ratified the Nauvoo Charter without much debate. Politicians knew the Mormons would be an important voting bloc, and they were funneling in by the thousands. And they felt bad for the Saints after their experience in Missouri, right? Both Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas voted to approve the charter, and they personally congratulated Reckitt Bennett once it was passed. Plus, it was a pretty busy legislative session when the charter was passed, so they probably didn't even read it to begin with. More than a dozen similar charters were rubber-stamped through the Illinois legislature that same year. In any case, these politicians could hardly have anticipated that the Nauvoo Legion would prove to be a military force superior to any other Western militia, and nearly a third the size of the United States Army within just 3.5 years' time. That was more than twice the size of any state militia in just one city. Right? These politicians could hardly have guessed that in addition to being prophet and trustee in trust of the church, Joe would also make himself mayor of Nauvoo once Reckitt Bennett was ousted, head of the city council, justice of the peace, and lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion all at once. Joe was building a theocracy. And the Nauvoo Charter in Doctrine and Covenants, Section 124, laid the foundation in subtle modifications to dry, boring, legal boilerplate, provisions and charters that made so no one would blink twice. But upon Nauvoo becoming a legally recognized entity, Joe successfully married the three pillars of social control: government, military, and religious, into a single body. This was unprecedented in American history, but common enough in world history that the American Constitution attempted to build in multiple barriers to stop Joseph Smith or to stop what he did from ever becoming possible. With the 3 pillars of social control and the 3 pillars of government under his control, Joe became untouchable. With city charter in hand, Joe started passing acts to set up the city government. He divided the city into wards, and that's the first use of the word ward in Mormon history. That was a municipal rather than an ecclesiastical unit of organization. He also passed a Religious Freedom Act that made it a crime to disrupt a religious meeting or to participate in a mob or to disobey a civil officer in executing his duty. Now, in some ways, the act was surprisingly progressive because it protected Muslims as well as Christians. At least that was the wording and the intent, that was the wording of it. But really, the intent was to protect the church. And primarily, it seems designed to prevent any further persecution of the sort that the Saints had faced in Missouri. It also gave Joe wide and sweeping draconian powers to violate freedom of speech, which he frequently abused. For instance, 3 years after the order was passed, Joe commanded the city marshal to arrest Augustine Spencer for alleged assault of his brother Orson Spencer. And the marshal asked for help from Chauncey Higbee, Robert D. Foster, and Charles Foster, 3 printers of the Nauvoo Expositor. Charles Foster, all of them resisted helping them out, and Charles Foster even pointed a pistol at Joseph Smith's chest before that pistol was removed from his hands. These 3 men considered the arrest to be unjust, and they refused to help Joseph Smith in trying to arrest Augustine Spencer. So Joe ordered those guys arrested too, because they violated the Religious Freedom Act by disobeying a city official executing his duty. Episode 197. Joe also incorporated a bunch of businesses in the Nauvoo Charter. For instance, he set up the Nauvoo Agricultural and Manufacturing Association with $100,000 of capital stock to be sold to subscribers, and Joe to act as one of the commissioners to sell the stock. He also set up the Nauvoo House Association in exactly the same way. And it's like, it's maddening because these businesses didn't have any assets. They didn't have any capital investment. They were just paper companies established with an arbitrary stock value, exactly like the Kirtland Anti-Banking Company had been. Like when you don't have money, just print some, right? It worked so well for Joe before. How could it possibly go awry this time? It's so amazing. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. This is criminal insanity. This is basically counterfeiting without actually counterfeiting. It's printing money. Now, we've been talking about how the city and the city ordinances made the offices of mayor and major general super powerful, and it laid the groundwork for Joseph Smith to occupy both offices when he became vice mayor, and then John C. Recket Bennett was ousted, right? And I need to add that caveat here. Joe didn't make himself mayor right away. First, he gave that office to his left-hand man, John C. Recket Bennett. Bennett was more politically experienced and better connected than Joe. And I think that Joe was basically apprenticing under Bennett. Besides, Joe already had a lot on his plate running the church and the land deals, so he probably found it easier to have basically a figurehead running the city than to run it himself anyway. And as long as Bennett remained loyal, having him as mayor and lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion wasn't functionally any different from Joe doing those jobs himself. And they lived together in the homestead anyway. They were best friends, so Joe felt he could trust Bennett for over a year and a half. With Bennett's help, Joe spent a couple of years consolidating his theocracy in Nauvoo and organizing it, which really came in handy in June 1841 when Missouri officials made an effort to rearrest good old Jailbreak Joe so that he could finally be tried on the treason charges from back in 1838 from the war there. But unfortunately for Missouri, Joe planned for this. By June of 1841, he not only controlled the Nauvoo city government and the Hancock County government, but also had people in the government of neighboring Adams County, including the Master of Chancery, Charles A. Warren. Like, he had a lot of people in his pocket. So when a posse from Missouri arrested Joseph Smith and tried to carry him away through Adams County into Missouri, Warren immediately put into effect the contingency plan for this scenario. He issued a writ of habeas corpus and he ordered Joe brought before the Adams County Court. The posse, of course, they complied with the order, and a hearing date was set for a few days later. A writ of habeas corpus, by the way, then, that's just the constitutional right that allows for an arrested person to challenge the legality of the arrest. A power that Joe really, really liked and vigorously expanded in Nauvoo on repeated occasions. Now, meanwhile, a bunch of Joe's most dangerous enforcers, including murderers William Hickman, Wild Bill Hickman, and Hosea Stout, they showed up during this arrest to make sure that the arresting officers made no attempt to whisk Joe away before that hearing for a writ of habeas corpus. They found Joe in charge of Adams County Sheriff Thomas King and an officer from Missouri. That night, Sheriff King mysteriously fell ill, which wouldn't be the first time that one of Joe's enemies got sick or died at a super convenient time. We're going to talk about that in a few episodes as well. So 3 days after all this went down, after Joe was arrested and the hearing, everything. So 3 days after this all went down, a hearing was held with notorious friend of the Mormons, Stephen A. Douglas, sitting as judge. And that is the same Stephen A. Douglas as in Lincoln and Douglas, right? Like that's the same Stephen A. Douglas. And Douglas knew that he needed to pander to the Mormons to get their votes in an upcoming election, or else he was going to lose in Adams County. Now, the short version of the story is that Joe's lawyers argued that the Missouri grand jury indictment for Joe's treason was obtained through fraud and bribery and was motivated by religious persecution, and that Missouri's real goal with this indictment was to stir a mob against Joseph Smith and make him vulnerable to vigilante justice. Their argument was bolstered by the fact that an angry mob gathered outside the courthouse during the hearing and erected a makeshift gallows. Right? So, yeah, it seems reasonable. The lawyer for the prosecution, meanwhile, ended up seeming drunk, and he fell sick in the middle of the proceedings, and then he fled from the courtroom, puking all the way. Once again, super convenient timing for somebody to fall ill when they're trying to hold Joseph Smith accountable to the system of law. Now, ultimately, Judge Douglas ruled that due to a chain of custody issue with the indictment, it was no longer valid, and that Joseph Smith was to be set free. Joe marched out of that courtroom that day, surrounded by 60 bodyguards and the local sheriffs to protect him from the mob that had established the gallows. Now, to add an extra wrinkle to all of this story, there was a rumor reported by Hinchman Sidney Rigdon that Illinois Governor Thomas Carlin deliberately issued an illegal writ in order to lure Joe to come to this courthouse in order for vigilante justice to be served, but that he had a legal writ ready to be served on Joe after the trial. So if there was another writ waiting for Joseph Smith, Joe's bodyguards never let those arresting officers get close enough to actually serve that writ of arrest. But from all we can tell, that was just a rumor. Episode 89. This was the first, but certainly not the last time that Joe would exploit the right of habeas corpus to escape arrest in the Nauvoo era. Having used it successfully once, he passed a bunch of laws to expand habeas corpus rights in Nauvoo so that all a prisoner had to do was write an explanation of why they shouldn't be detained, and the writ of habeas corpus would immediately be granted by the Nauvoo Municipal Court. Arresting officers who refused to honor that writ of habeas corpus right that the city had passed would be arrested by city authorities and jailed in Nauvoo. Episodes 134, 136, 138, 165, and 171. Joe's Nauvoo theocracy faced one of its first big challenges in May of 1842 when John C. Bennett was excommunicated. That's why we call him Wreck-It Bennett. He wrecked everything, right? And we'll get into some of the reasons for all of that in a coming episode in the series here. But for now, it's enough to say that Bennett's departure left a huge power vacuum in the city. We called it the Bennett Meltdown series on the show because the void and destruction left behind after his violent departure and his subsequent expose forever scarred the kingdom on the Mississippi, and in many ways fueled what happened in Carthage. Once Bennett was excommunicated, Joe took over as mayor of the city, but I think he knew he wasn't really qualified to lead the Nauvoo Legion, which is why he wanted, he wanted somebody with some experience to run his real military force, the Nauvoo Legion. So Joe appointed James Arlington Bennett, who was not related to John C. Bennett, so he replaced John C. Bennett as Major General and Inspector General of the Nauvoo Legion. That ultimately didn't work out because James Arlington Bennett wasn't a Mormon. He lived 1,000 miles from Nauvoo. He lived in New York, and he wasn't willing to move to the city in spite of this, extremely honorable appointment. But Joe and James Arlington Bennett exchanged a bunch of romance letters in which they fantasized about founding this new empire together in the West. Now, weirdly, Joe appointed another unrelated non-Mormon Bennett, who also lived 1,000 miles from Nauvoo, as James Arlington's aide-de-camp. This third Bennett was James Gordon Bennett, a newspaperman who had written negative articles about the Mormons in the past and who also had no intention of moving to Nauvoo. But like James Arlington, James Gordon Bennett fantasized about a Western empire and the role that he might play in that empire. He published an article in which he asked, quote, "May not this wonderful Mormon movement be the signal for a new religious revolution? Is not Joe Smith its master spirit and General Bennett its military spirit? They can already dictate to the state of Illinois, and if they pursue the same policy in other states, will they not soon dictate to Congress and decide the presidency?" End quote. Now, the tone of this Bennett's article is disputed. I tend to read it with a fair bit of snark and sarcasm. However, the sentiment that he conveyed is absolutely true. The Mormon Empire and Joe's penchant for criminal regimes placed the Mormon kingdom on a dangerous trajectory for a quote-unquote new religious revolution. Now, if all of this business with the three Bennetts sounds crazy, that's because it is. Was Joe obsessed with guys named Bennett who had delusions of grandeur? Apparently, John C. Wreck-It Bennett recommended these other two Bennetts for the job, and Joe followed that recommendation. So maybe it was John C. Bennett who was obsessed with other fellow narcissistic Bennetts. They were all kindred scoundrels, episode 115. For their part, as much as they genuinely liked the idea of a Western Empire and the military spirit of Mormonism, the Bennetts were most likely just having a bit of fun with Joe and how crazy it all seemed. And they thought that this whole thing was just a gas, Although James Arlington Bennett took it a little bit more seriously than James Gordon Bennett did. Within a few months, Joe got real and he eventually appointed a Nauvoo Mormon named Wilson Law. Wilson and William Law, right? It's a law episode. As the Legion's Major General instead. That's episode 132, where we talk about all three of these Bennetts, and episode 199, where we talk about the laws. Now, as long as we're in 1842, which, coincidentally, is the year that Mary Rudge, the first competitive female chess player who faced purely male competition and won, that's the year she was born. So let's mention 1842's gubernatorial election. The Mormons were a powerful swing voting bloc, and they weren't committed to either major national party, the Whigs or the Democrats, so they courted both parties. They finally settled on the Democrats, throwing their votes to Thomas Ford for governor of Illinois. They also elected Crazy Willie Smith, the Prophet Joe's younger brother, as Nauvoo's representative to the Illinois legislature. Now, Thomas Ford was a smart guy. He knew the Mormons had gotten him elected, but he also knew that they were a problem. So he always had to thread a very delicate needle in all of his dealings with them. The court records from the Missouri Mormon War back in 1838 had been released at the beginning of Ford's campaign year, and Ford undoubtedly read those Missouri Mormon War Court of Inquiry records to understand how the Mormon population could quickly spiral out of control during his tenure as governor. For instance, Joe sent the new Governor Ford a letter asking him to acquit Joe of the outstanding warrant from Missouri, signed by his predecessor, Governor Thomas Carlin. Governor Ford replied to that request that he believed the outstanding warrant to be illegal, but that he didn't think it wise to nullify it by executive order. Joe needed to come to Springfield to have the case heard before the Supreme Court of Illinois. So, Joe took Governor Ford up on that the following year. He traveled to Springfield with a lawyer and 100 bodyguards, of course, and successfully got the writ nullified, episode 162. By 1843, Joe had intelligence that the Missouri officials were crafting an airtight extradition order to come after him again. His response was to establish a new Nauvoo City police force with a mandate to, quote, arrest all persons who may be found in said city at unusual hours and under suspicious circumstances, and bring such person or persons before the captain of the police, who may in his discretion detain such person or persons until such time as the mayor or some alderman can examine into the nature of the charges against him or them, end quote. Now, what that means is, if any marshals, constables, or sheriffs came into Nauvoo looking for Joe, or even anybody who looks suspicious who is out around the city at unusual hours, this new police force could detain them while Joe made his escape. And then, of course, Joe stacked the police force with his closest and most violent cronies, purely Danites through and through. Around the same time, Nauvoo held its citywide elections. Joseph Smith was, of course, elected mayor, and all of his cronies were given their same positions in the city government that they held before the election. Or their power was expanded by appointing them to new boards and offices in addition to all of their old positions, right? This was no election. This was a fledgling dictatorship masquerading as a democracy. And more importantly, it's what Joe always wanted. Now, during the swearing in of the new city councilors, Joe prophesied to the city recorder that it would be best for the council never to impose any taxes or fees. If they would just cut all unnecessary expenses and deregulate the city, then, quote, capitalists would come in from all quarters and build mills, factories, and machinery of all kind. New buildings would arise on every hand, and Nauvoo would become a great city, the best city, a huge city, end quote. I added those last little parts, right? But at this time, when he said that they should not impose taxes or fees and deregulate the city and invite capitalists in, Joe himself had over $100,000 in debt to his name, nearing very close to $200,000, mostly because of the land purchases that we discussed earlier. He wanted to build up Nauvoo's economy really fast and finance everything with even more debt, of course, while also cutting taxes. Joe had tried to file for bankruptcy back in 1842, but was unsuccessful in doing so. It's incredible, isn't it? Like, if we just take a step back and look at this in the meta, Joe started as a poor boy in rags who thought socialism was great and charity never faileth. But once he climbed the social ladder through a steady and constant onslaught of lies and deception and manipulation, he's a libertarian capitalist. It's so weird how we can see that transition right in front of us. If only Twitter were a thing during the Nauvoo era, Joe would make a legitimately viable presidential candidate. So, no taxes, tons of debt, no factories in the city, no wealth coming into the city, an unsuccessful bid to file for bankruptcy, and most of the converts were destitute before they even made it into Nauvoo, regardless of whether they came from Missouri or from Europe. How was Joe running his empire? More lies and more counterfeit. More. Never can have enough. So let's start with the lies. Joe had his hotel called the Nauvoo House, and he wanted it built with volunteer labor. So Joe took the Lord's name in vain again and told everybody that it was a commandment from God to build the Nauvoo house and that it was just as important as the temple. Here are his exact words, quote, "The building of the Nauvoo house is just as sacred in my view as the temple. I want the Nauvoo house built. It must be built. Our salvation depends on it. Brethren, hurry on to the Nauvoo house thus, and you will build it. You will then be on Pisgah's top, and the great men will come from the four quarters of the earth, will pile the gold and silver into it till you are weary of receiving them." End quote. I feel like that quote alone encapsulates Joe's life more than any of his other statements, except maybe telling people that he has more to boast of than Jesus, right? This is a close second to that statement. I command you, in the name of God, to build me a hotel so I can get rich. If Joe tried that manipulation tactic in 1826 when he was convicted of being a glass looker, he'd be laughed out of town. He was laughed out of town. Well, not really laughed out of town so much as chased out with torches and pitchforks, but you get what I mean. But since he had built his reputation and was surrounded by legions of sycophants, all built on this empire of lies, this was regarded as legitimately the words of Almighty God. What more do we need to understand the person of Joseph Smith and his motivations than him telling everybody in the name of God to hurry up and finish building his hotel so that he could finally be rich? I mean, that kind of says it all, doesn't it? Joe also told the saints to bring all of their gold and silver and all of their building materials and donate them to the project of building the Nauvoo house, right? And if they refused, they were basically stealing from God. Quote, "If any are hungry or naked, don't take away the brick, timber, and materials that belong to the Nauvoo house, but come and tell me, and I will divide with them to the last morsel." That sounds so nice, right? Joe will give him food off of his own table. Then he says, "And then if the man is not satisfied, I will kick his backside." End quote. Like, that started generous, but once again, it ended with violent resolution. If somebody's hungry, don't use material designated for the Nauvoo house to feed yourself. I'll take care of all your problems. I'll feed you. I'll be your savior. And if you aren't satisfied, prepare to have your backside kicked. If they aren't killed by your kindness, then just kill them with your Danites, of course. Episode 139. Obviously, in addition to taking donations for the Nauvoo house, Joe was also taking donations for the temple. Now, the temple building committee sometimes took donations in money, but usually took them in goods. Now, once they took in the donations, the temple building community would issue people who worked on the temple vouchers in exchange for their physical labor, which they could use to purchase goods from the temple building committee store. So this actually had a long-term effect of raising capital and getting labor done on the temple at nearly no cost. And it also created a new form of money to exchange, the temple store vouchers. So once people realized the Nauvoo house and the agricultural certificates were all worthless, this new system became the new form of money that wasn't actually money, these temple store vouchers. Now, thus far, this concept was actually pretty brilliant, right? But if we consider the implications for just a second, it's incredibly manipulative. Right? Think about this. Any donations that were made to the temple building committee were recorded in the book of the law of the Lord, or the Balal, as we called it on the show. Now, Joel portrayed the Balal as an earthly equivalent of the book of life. If your name was recorded in the book of the law of the Lord, then you were saved, and what is bound on earth is bound in heaven. If your name wasn't recorded in it, then you weren't allowed access to the temple. This was basically a spiritual extortion scheme. Episode 191. This and many other schemes, predicated on pure lies, of course, were one aspect of financing the Mormon Empire debt. Empire of debt. It's a Mormon empire. It's an empire of debt. Everything was done all with debt. But what about the counterfeit portion of this, the bogus? Well, around the same time that Joe created this temple building scheme to get people to volunteer work and volunteer possessions and to get the temple built, and then also telling the city to not raise taxes, Joe also seems to have developed a pretty large counterfeiting operation. Now, Joe had probably at least dabbled in counterfeiting before, but in 1843, bogus money was everywhere in Nauvoo. Some of the hottest collector items among Mormon artifact collectors today are Nauvoo bogus coins. And bogus, of course, means counterfeit coins, right? Counterfeit money, that's paper money. Counterfeit coins is known as bogus. Joe recruited a bunch of people into his bogus making operation, including not only Mormons like Theodore Turley and Peter Hawes, but also non-Mormons like Joseph H. Jackson, Edward Bonney, Marinus G. Eaton, and an old family friend from Vermont. We don't actually have a lot of details about this counterfeit operation because it was understandably very secretive, but there's a lot of evidence there to say that it did indeed exist. Eventually, the whole quorum of 12 apostles, in addition to Joseph H. Jackson, would be indicted for counterfeiting after Joe's death. Use a counterfeit $20 bill in Minneapolis, and it's a death sentence. Run an entire counterfeiting operation, and people call you the prophet of the restoration and sing praise to you every Sunday. America's pretty great. We're doing great stuff here in America. White collar crime like this, this was Joe's forte. This is how he lived. He breathed criminality. He slept on a bed of lies. Joe's avarice for power couldn't be reined in. Money and power, they all go hand in bloody hand. He could never get enough. So let's hone in on politics to kind of run us out for today's episode and mark complete the first episode in our 10-part series to finally bury Joe and his legacy once and for all. In 1843, the Whig candidate for Congress in Nauvoo's congressional district was a guy named Cyrus Walker, said to be the best criminal lawyer in Western Illinois. By this time, Joe had been involved in dozens of legal cases, and he knew the power of having a good lawyer on his side that he could afford, right? And not public defenders. No, they're terrible at their job. No, we need good lawyers. So he promised, public defenders actually weren't even a thing at this time. I don't know why I said that. Anyway, so Joe promised Walker, Cyrus Walker, the Mormon vote in exchange for Walker being Joe's attorney after Joe was arrested in Dixon, Illinois, and rescued by his Danites, episodes 144 through 147. Cyrus Walker agreed. He made Mormon rights a prominent part of his political platform, and he stopped campaigning and worked the rest of that election season as Joe's personal lawyer. Joe swore multiple times from the pulpit that the Mormons would vote for Cyrus Walker. But while Walker offered a carrot, the Democrats offered a carrot and a stick. The Democrat candidate Joseph Hoge also made Mormon rights a part of his platform. That was Hoge's carrot. The stick was the threat of dispatching the Illinois militia. In June of 1843, Joe was arrested by those sheriffs from Missouri, Sheriffs Reynolds and Wilson, but a Nauvoo court ordered his release under a writ of habeas corpus. Just yet one more time that the power of habeas corpus in Nauvoo benefited the prophet, right? These sheriffs then went to the Democratic Illinois governor, Thomas Ford, and asked him to call out the militia to go raid Nauvoo and to take Joe into custody. 2 days before that election, a prominent Democrat promised a Mormon agent that the Democrats wouldn't call out the militia if the Mormons voted Democrat. But no one was in the room where it happened, though, right? So the day before the election, Joe flipped, and he told his followers that his brother Hiram had had a revelation that they should vote for the Democrats instead of Walker. As a result, Hoge trounced Walker in Hancock County, and the Whigs lost their minds. And the Whig newspapers started a full-fledged campaign to expose Joseph Smith and to bring him to justice. Agitation by these Whig newspapers significantly contributed to Joe's assassination 9 months after this little stunt, and certainly became a pea in the bed of Democrat Governor Ford's and Joe's friendship. So much for Hiram's, revelation that they would be protected. That's episode 162. In late December of that year, Joe undertook an even bigger political project than, manipulating an election and, doing this little, political horse racing. He dispatched Orson Pratt to lobby Illinois legislators to pass into law a document titled Memorial to Congress. The memorial claimed that because of the persecution that the Mormons had constantly faced, the Mormons and their city of Nauvoo should be treated not as a city, but as a sovereign U.S. territory, a city-state, a Mormon Vatican. It also proposed that the mayor of Nauvoo be authorized to call upon the U.S. Army to defend against mobs and state militias, and that the Nauvoo Legion be paid wages by Illinois state taxes rather than by taxes paid by the citizens of the city of Nauvoo. I mean, there's so many poison pills in this memorial to Congress, right? And this is separate from the 100,000 soldiers that Joe wanted to get from Congress to go liberate the Oregon Territory. Considering that the non-Mormons of Illinois were already justifiably outraged by how much power the Nauvoo Charter gave Joseph Smith, this brazen attempt to expand the power to the federal level and declare Nauvoo a sovereign city territory, it was so brazen, and it frankly pretty absurd when it comes to Joe's power plays. Episodes 165, 197, and 201. And now, finally, we come to 1844 and Joe's run for presidency of the United States. 1844 is also the first year that a telegraph was sent by Samuel Morse. Fun fact. The 1844 election pitted Martin Van Buren for the Democrats against Henry Clay for the Whigs. Both Van Buren and Clay had rejected Mormon requests for redress after the Missouri Mormon War. Van Buren coldly and Clay snarkily. So Joe refused to support either candidate. And instead, he announced himself as an independent candidate for president of the United States. Joe's presidential platform, ghostwritten by William Hines Phelps, double dub, included some noble statements like buying all of the black people out of slavery, but also some terrible sentiments like expansion into Canada and Mexico and the annexation of Oregon and Texas. And this was no token campaign effort either. Joe dispatched over 300 missionaries to every corner of the U.S. to promote his campaign, including such prominent church leaders as Hinchman Sidney Rigdon, Brigham Young, Parley P. Pratt. Although Joe didn't have a realistic chance, the Mormons seemed to believe that he could win. On January 29th, 1844, Joe recorded in his journal that he drank a toast to the statement, quote, "May Nauvoo become the empire seat of government," end quote, which provides a window into his truly revolutionary mindset if one of his first plans was to relocate the national capital to Nauvoo. In connection with Joe's presidential campaign, he also founded a secret council called the Council of 50, episodes 168, 69, and 70. The Council of 50 was constituted as a shadow government of the kingdom on earth with its own constitution. Members were sworn to secrecy under penalty of losing their heads. Not satisfied with shooting for president of the United States, Joe had himself anointed King of the Kingdom of God on April 11th, 1844. Interestingly, the Council of 50 included 3 non-Mormons, including 2 of Joe's counterfeiting buddies and an inventor named Uriah Brown. Talked about him last week, from whom Joe hoped to buy the designs for an experimental flamethrower weapon which could be mounted on a submarine, which he would then sell to the Russian emperor to form an alliance to overthrow the powers that be. Any analysis of Joseph Smith and early Mormonism, it leaves many questions and plenty of unsolvable puzzles. There are, however, many trends and actions that we can use the basis of just economic analysis to understand. Follow the money. With money comes power, and the inverse is true as well. Joe's pure, unadulterated rapaciousness drove so many of his actions and decisions which preceded his actions. Whether it was power, money, possessions, women, which we didn't even get into in this episode, followers, land, public adoration, or any other quantifiable commodity, more was never enough for Joseph Smith. More. He could never be satisfied. And he was proud of what he did and what he made, but he was jealous of what he could make or could do. He never acquired his wealth through honest, hard labor. Every moment of his life was marked by dishonesty and quick, easy money that often wasn't his to begin with. He convinced some wealthy parishioners to devote every worldly possession that they had to building up the kingdom of God. And when that wasn't enough, he sought consumption of every institution known to humanity in the 1840s with a deeply rooted desire for himself to be on top of his own system of theocratic governments once those systems were consumed. The voice of his people didn't matter. And when Joe was challenged, he was likely to lash out and act violently to get his way, whether that was kicking the backsides of his followers or committing war crimes and treason against militias of a state. It didn't matter. Joe's voice was the voice of God, and nothing would satisfy his manifest destiny of materialism and a transcendent authoritarianism. I want to tell you so many more stories from early Mormon history, but I realize that no matter how many pages of script I write, it's simply never enough. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.bandcamp.com and used with permission. Legal counsel is provided by Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC. Copyright 2020. All rights reserved.